Good morning. Welcome to another edition of Inquisition Update. My name's Tom Press, and I'll be your host for the next hour. You're listening to FirstAmendmentRadio.com, and thanks for tuning in, everyone. Well, I'm back after a brief 2-day hiatus, and I appreciate the little time off and the rest and recreation. Everyone needs that from time to time. And but I'm back fresh and ready to engage myself in the battle that we've been engaged with for the last 9 years or so here at Inquisition Update, to prove to my listeners who is the Antichrist of the Bible, and to inform my listeners what really is the Protestant Reformation, and to denounce the ecumenical movement as an act of Satan in the world, a grand deception that has been promoted by the belief in futurism, which exonerates the papacy of the onus of Antichrist and puts it on a fiction, a futurist fiction. So, with that, and after last time we were live on the broadcast, we concluded Richard Bennett's writing on Pope Francis I. It was entitled Pope Francis the Fox. And many thanks to Richard Bennett for that revealing and very interesting and edifying work, as I appreciate all of his works. And at the end of the broadcast, I kind of put out a teaser reminding my listeners that 2017 is the 500th anniversary of the official start of the Protestant Reformation by Martin Luther on October 31st, 1517, and I thought it appropriate, since Rome is taking the advantage of leading this 500-year celebration of the Protestant Reformation that literally toppled the papacy and made all of Europe aware that the papacy is, was, and always will be the Antichrist of the Bible, literally toppled the Pope's supremacy in Europe and marked him as Antichrist. That's what Martin Luther did. That is what we need to celebrate. The 500th anniversary of the toppling of the Antichrist of the Bible, the papacy, and the reestablishment of Christ, the true and only King of Kings and Lord of Lords. That is much to celebrate. But 500 years later, the situation is quite different. Having believed in futurism, that the Antichrist is an individual that comes in the future, Protestants have exonerated the papacy. And by their belief, they have repudiated the Protestant Reformation as a grievous error, that Martin Luther and all the Protestant reformers were wrong in their assessment that the papacy is, was, and always will be the Antichrist of Scripture and of history and of prophecy. And so now it's time to, well, come home to Mother Church. And Rome has graciously rolled out the yellow carpet for all the yellow bellies that want to go back to the Pharaoh in Rome. And I hope you'll apologize for my frankness, but that's what it amounts to. And so Rome wants to rub it in, this 500th year anniversary. Rome wants to retreat to her original position that Martin Luther was a heretic, that the Protestant Reformation was a grievous assault upon the only representative of God on the earth, the papacy. Rome wants to rub it in that all the governments of the world that served the papacy prior to the Protestant Reformation should now once again serve the papacy as his vassals. That now, having repudiated the Protestant Reformation and the protest against the Antichrist in Rome, now believing in a future Antichrist, the papacy says, okay, it ought to be self-evident to my princes, the cardinals and the bishops. It ought to be self-evident to the kings and the governors of the world, the quote-unquote Christian nobility of every rank, that having repudiated their own Reformation and repudiated the damage that was done at the time of the Protestant Reformation, well, then all of that power and prestige and authority should be restored to the papacy. The Protestants have repudiated their own belief that the papacy is, was, and always will be the Antichrist. They now believe in a future one. So common sense dictates that the papacy should be restored to every authority and power and prestige and immunity that he enjoyed prior to the Protestant Reformation. That the whole Christian world should pay reparation to the papacy, and that they should once again serve as his vassals. And not just the kings of the earth, but the people too must obey the papacy, the self-styled legitimate authority of God on earth, the papacy. That's where we are today. That's the basis of the ecumenical movement. We're submitting to Rome. We're submitting to the historical, the biblical, and the prophetic Antichrist, because we no longer believe that he's the Antichrist. We believe in a future one that hasn't come yet. And the kings and the governments of the world are reflating their responsibilities now. Is it to the people or is it to the Pope? And if it's to the Pope, what about all the laws that we've passed or that the people have demanded? Do they contradict what the papacy says is law? And if so, should those laws and liberties that the people promulgated, should they be overthrown and replaced with Roman Catholic canon law? Do you feel like you're losing your liberties here in the United States of America? Now you have a perfect explanation why. Because the laws in this country that protect personal and collective civil liberties and rights and privileges are promulgated by the people. See, under the papal system, the people don't promulgate any rules, regulations, laws, or anything. Under the papal system of government, the papacy is supreme. And he dictates the laws. As the quote-unquote legitimate authority of God on earth, God hidden under a veil of flesh, the papacy is judge of every man, and no man may judge him. The government should serve and promulgate the laws submitted by the papacy. And those laws apply to the people, and the people must obey, or be found subject to prosecution by the civil power. That's where we're going. That's what the entire ecumenical movement is about, and not only a reestablishment of papal control over the civil governments, but the Vatican's control over ecclesiastical matters too. Do you go to a Protestant or evangelical church? Well, the laws and the order of that church is changing. It's not the people who comprise the church. It is the hierarchy, those who are direct subservience to the papacy. That is, the priest or the priester and the board of directors of your church. They answer now to a higher authority, not the people. And so now, even in the churches, they are to implement Roman Catholic canon law and tradition. And it's happening gradually as we speak. And every day the churches become more Catholic in their belief and more Catholic in their practice. I mean, after all, if we're going to have peace and unity among all the so-called Christian denominations, there must be but one authority. There cannot be conflict. So the papacy is gaining the supremacy that it once enjoyed in all the churches and in all the governments, as I've said before. So what was the Protestant Reformation? This is the knowledge that's been lost. This is the knowledge that our pastors and priesters have hidden from us. What was the protest about? And who was the protest against? And the best and only real way is to read the writings of the Protestant reformers, those who made the protest official. Now, before I even continue any further with this, let me tell you, throughout the Christian era, since the days of Christ, there have always been protesters of this Antichrist. And Paul predicted his rise and positively identified who he would be. He would be that power that replaced the Caesars that were then in power at the time of Paul's writings. 2 Thessalonians 2 verse 7, he who now letteth, or he who now restrains the rise of Antichrist, will continue to let or restrain the rise of Antichrist until he is taken out of the way. God's going to take him out of the way. And then that man of sin shall be revealed, that wicked one. Now the Thessalonians knew precisely who Paul was speaking of because Paul spoke to them face to face. But in the letter that he wrote to the Thessalonians, he had to be very clandestine in what he was saying, so that if his letter had fallen into Roman hands, he and the Thessalonians would not be subject to the Roman power for literally predicting the fall of the Roman Empire and the fall of the Caesars. They would have been regarded as seditious and inciting a rebellion against the Roman authorities. So Paul was very cryptic and but poignant. Cryptic but poignant. I mean, there's no way to mistake the word now. Paul was speaking in the then and now at the time of his writings. He who now letteth will let till he be taken out of the way. And that's the only one that could apply to is the Roman Caesars. They were the ones who were then in power. So Paul reiterated in his letter with language that was not altogether specific, but that reminded the Thessalonians of who it was that he spoke to them personally about. We can imagine Paul made no bones about it. It was the power then existing, the Caesars. And when that government, that fourth and final beast, as is described in the Bible, first Babylon, Medo-Persia, then Greece, then Rome, the fourth and final, the Bible doesn't list a fifth. So it's a Roman power. It's going to be replaced. And since there is no fifth, it's still going to be a Roman power, isn't it? The fourth and final beast upon the earth is the fourth. That's the Roman beast. And Paul was literally talking about the fall of the pagan Roman Empire and the rise of the papal Roman Empire. Still Roman. Still the fourth beast. Still the successor of first the Babylonians, then the Medo-Persians, then the Grecians, and finally the Romans. Rome is the culmination of all the paganism and apostasy that preceded it in the history of Daniel's prophecies. Babylon, Medo-Persia, Greece, finally Rome. Rome is literally the storehouse of all that pagan belief. and added to it was a form of Christianity, and it was not Christianity at all, but it's anti-Christianity. Goes under the mask and the costume of Christianity, but on close examination, as Martin Luther did, he discovered that it's not Christianity at all, and that the papacy is no representative of Jesus Christ on the earth. He's as God unto himself. Now, Martin Luther put these thoughts in writing. They're still available to be read today. I have 2 of those works in front of me. And I was at a bit of a quandary, and I teased my listeners Friday with the notion that I would read first The Babylonian Captivity of the Church, written by Martin Luther. I have another work entitled Open Letter to the Christian Nobility of the German Nation Concerning the Reform of the Christian Estate. This also written by Martin Luther. And I was a bit in a quandary as to which one would be appropriate to read first. And after beginning the reading of The Babylonian Captivity, written by Martin Luther, I discovered that this work preceded it. So I'm going to begin not with The Babylonian Captivity, but Martin Luther's Open Letter to the Christian Nobility of the German Nation. This information is available online. Just Google the title. You'll find a PDF and other renderings of this work. But that's what we're going to focus on for the next several days. Let's find out what Martin Luther thought. He expressed himself in writing. And these writings are going to be the basis for Rome's quote-unquote celebration of the 500th anniversary of the Protestant Reformation. Rome regarded Martin Luther as a rebel and a heretic. That has never changed. And this apparently friendly celebration is going to tactfully reiterate Rome's original assessment of Martin Luther. And our attempt here at First Amendment Radio is to resurrect the real Martin Luther for examination by the Protestants of this nation. Was he a heretic? Was he a rebel? Or was he a defender of Jesus Christ? Was the Protestant Reformation a rebellion against the legitimate authority of Christ on earth, the papacy? Or was it a return to true biblical Christianity? That's what I hope my listeners can determine for themselves upon the completion of the readings of his writings. Okay, without any further ado, we're going to begin Martin Luther's own words in an open letter to the Christian nobility of the German nation concerning the Protestant Reformation. I'll just begin by prefacing, it was becoming widely known and recognized and accepted that the papacy is not the head of Christendom. It is the head of Antichrist. Europe was on the verge of rebelling against the Antichrist, having now finally identified who the Antichrist is, just as all Protestants did throughout the Christian era. This is a widespread knowledge that the papacy is, was, and always will be the Antichrist. And so the immediate question to Martin Luther is, should the kings of Europe, having this knowledge, should the nobility of Europe, having this knowledge, the nobility either in the church or in the secular power, the states, the big servants, the big names, should they continue to serve the Pope? Or should they serve the people? Should they serve Christ? That's the question. And that's the purpose of this open letter that Martin Luther so brazenly and boldly wrote to the Christian nobility of Europe, and particularly Germany. What should be their role from here on out? And if there's any doubt in any of the minds of these nobility, who is the Antichrist and what role does the papacy play in the government of the world, he's going to spell it out for them so that they can make their own decisions. Okay, now, without any further ado, I'll begin the reading. The first portion of this reading is entitled The Three Walls of the Romanists. Okay, now Martin Luther defines Romanists, the word Romanists. And Romanists, according to Martin Luther, is the extreme right wing of the Roman Catholic Church. Those who believe and teach and practice that the papacy is, as it were, God on earth, and he is the final say in everything. He is the Alpha and Omega of the Christian Church. Okay? And that is contraposed by those in the Roman Catholic Church that, well, they weren't just quite sure who had the precedence. The popes, or the councils, or the popes and the councils together, or the scriptures. Okay? The Roman Catholic Church might call them liberal. Okay, we're talking about, Martin Luther defined the Romanists as those who held the belief that the papacy is, as it were, God on earth. We would call them Tridentine Roman Catholics today. They were the ones who would burn a Protestant at the stake for rejecting the papacy as God on earth. So Martin Luther's taken on the radical papists, the Romanists, as he calls them. Now, for my part, doesn't matter to me if they're right wing or left wing. The papacy is the Antichrist. The Roman Catholic Church is the synagogue of Satan, and they both together are leading God's people astray today in the ecumenical movement. So now that I'm on record, we're going to read this in the context that Martin Luther intended it, knowing in our heart of hearts that there is no Christian church called Catholic, and not Roman Catholic. Okay, it's the synagogue of Satan. All right, I hope I've prepared this properly. Now, there are three walls of the Romanists. Listen to what Martin Luther says. You be the judge. He says, the Romanists, with great adroitness, have built three walls about them. Three walls around them, behind which they have hitherto defended themselves in such wise that no one has been able to reform them. And this has been the cause of terrible corruption throughout all Christendom. First, when pressed by the temporal power, that's the state governments, the governments of the nations, when they are pressed by the temporal power, they have made decrees and said that the temporal power, that is the governments of Europe, have no jurisdiction over them, but on the other hand, that the spiritual, that is the papacy and the priests, is above the temporal power. Okay, we've come upon the break. We'll continue the reading of Martin Luther's words right after we get back from the break. Inquisition Update, First Amendment Radio.
Hear it first on FirstAmendmentRadio.com and FirstAmendmentRadio.net. The program you are listening to is 100% sponsored by you, the listener, on this First Amendment Rights Media channel. You will notice that there are few commercials on this radio network. There's a good reason for that. Corporate advertising dollars come with strings that limit program content. So without your help, these programs cannot continue on internet or our several affiliates. If you benefit by the educational law programs, we ask you to give. If you are admonished or nurtured by the Bible and ministry programs, we ask you to give. If some voice a cause that you are passionate about, we ask you to give. If you believe in any of these, we ask you to support them as you would a missionary on a continual basis, as if giving a tithe for missionary radio. These programs are not commercially viable and must be supported by those faithful to the cause of truth. Look for the button to sponsor your favorite programs at our listen and schedule pages on the internet. Then, when you subscribe, we will send you the last quarterly MP3 CD of that program immediately, and continue to do so with each new quarter. We will also give you unlimited archive access to all of our programs. We're asking you to give much less than a tithe, so that you may also send support directly to a particular program host, cause, and anywhere else the Spirit may lead you. Do all to the glory of our God and Creator, for His holy nation, the only kingdom that will last forever. Thank you for listening. Since the beginning of time, kings have sought it, nations have fought for it. It has been traded, it has been borrowed, it has been purchased, it has been stolen. There's a reason for it. To secure the blessings of liberty to ourselves and to our posterity, invest with the security of gold and silver. Call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188 or visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net. Listen to Financial Survival with your host Melody Cedarstrom right here on FirstAmendmentRadio.com at 4 p.m. Eastern or 1 p.m. Pacific Time. Visit discountgoldandsilvertrading.net or call Discount Gold and Silver Trading at 1-800-375-4188. Toll free 1-800-375-4188.
Okay, welcome back from the break. You're listening to the second half hour of Inquisition Update on First Amendment Radio. And if you'd like to support Inquisition Update, please support First Amendment Radio. If you'd like to make a contribution to me directly, get on your knees and pray God's mercy and grace, and pray for health and longevity. Pray that God always be the leader of Inquisition Update, that the Spirit of God guide and direct, and that the truth be told. The unpopular truth continue to be told on First Amendment Radio on Inquisition Update. Now, Martin Luther's writing, an open letter to the Christian nobility of the German nation concerning the reform of the Christian estate. This work is written by Martin Luther, and it's dated 1520, just 3 years after the official start of the Protestant Reformation. By another means of setup, I want to remind my listeners, if you don't already know, Martin Luther was in the bowels of the beast. He was a Roman Catholic monk. He was, I think, an Augustinian monk. And he had a protest against the papacy, and that's what this letter is about. And he's telling the Christian nobility of Europe, not just Germany, everywhere this publication was available. He says the Romanists, the right wing of the Roman Catholic Church, with great adroitness have built 3 walls about them, behind which they have hitherto defended themselves as such, in such wise that no one has been able to reform them. And this has been the cause of terrible corruption throughout all of Christendom. Okay, you can tell by many of the writings that we've read here on Inquisition Update, many of the books, when Rome was all powerful, it was infinitely corrupt. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. That's a truthful maxim. And any time in history when Rome had all the power, she was all corrupt. Terrible corruption. Anytime there's great power in Washington, D.C., or any other government of the world, there is terrible corruption. So this is a given. Martin Luther's just stating the evident. Now, he continues, he says, first, when pressed by the temporal power, that is the civil governments, they have made decrees and said that the temporal power has no jurisdiction over them. But on the other hand, that the spiritual is above the temporal power. So anytime, and we've read book after book after book here on Inquisition Update. The first one that comes to mind is Vicars of Christ, The Dark Side of the Papacy by Peter DeRosa. It enumerates throughout the history of the popes all of the debauchery, the murders, the genocides, the incest, and every other abomination committed by various popes throughout the history of the Roman Catholic Church. I don't want to touch that dirty stuff again. If you want to read that book for yourself, I've got a couple copies left. If you promise to read it, I send them out if you ask for them. But you can get that book online. There are many other books just like it that delineate and explain the unspeakable wickedness of individual popes throughout the history of the Roman Catholic Church. It's just ghastly. And how any of them could be regarded as the Vicar of Christ is beyond me. And look, it's the reality that Martin Luther came to was the wickedness of the popes. How could they possibly be a voice for God in the world? They're not. That's the point Martin Luther's making to the Christian nobility of Germany. He says, first, when pressed by the temporal power for their crimes, obviously, these, the Romanists, have made decrees and said that the temporal power has no jurisdiction over them, but on the other hand, that the spiritual, that is the papacy in his hierarchy, is above the temporal power. Now, this is embodied in Roman Catholic canon law. The Pope is the judge of every man, and no man may judge him. The example given that Jorge Bergoglio, the self-styled Vicar of Christ on the earth today, Pope Francis I, the Antichrist of our day, committed unspeakable atrocities when he was the Archbishop of Argentina. And he was on the verge of being prosecuted for his historic crimes. And that's why they made him Pope, so that no civil government in the world could prosecute him. Roman Catholic canon law says the Pope is judge of every man, and no man or institution of men can judge the Pope. So they make him a Pope, and he can't be prosecuted. We have the other example of the global pedophile priest pandemic in the world, where pedophilia is practiced openly by the priests, especially in Roman Catholic countries, and they can't be brought to justice. We've even seen attempt after attempt to bring pedophile priests to reckon in the United States of America. And what does Rome do? Claim jurisdiction over them and hustle them off to Rome and put them up in the Vatican. Okay, they don't do time. They don't have to testify in court. And those that are forced to testify in court, you know, Rome has simply washed their hands of them and turned them over to the civil power. But that's not the norm. That's an exception. Typically, throughout history, no court or any civil jurisdiction has any authority whatsoever on the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. They are the servants of the Pope. They answer to him and to him only. And so, as just extensions of the papacy, when these priests get caught doing what they're doing, the Pope just reels them in and tells the civil governments, hands off, they're mine. I'll deal with them. So this, Martin Luther's telling us a reality that is still present today. Unspeakable, terrible corruption, and the civil power has no jurisdiction to punish them. This is the outrage that Martin Luther is expressing to the nobility of Germany. And it still goes on today. And I want to ask my listeners, common sense dictates a natural question. If this corruption is what brought about the Protestant Reformation, why is Rome celebrating the Protestant Reformation? She's not. She's condemning it. That's what this 500th anniversary is all about. To condemn Martin Luther and his suggestion that the priests and the popes of Rome are not above the law of God. They're not above the civil laws of the land. And they're just like you and me. And they ought to be punished for doing wrong. He says, first, when they are pressed by the temporal power, obviously for crimes that they have committed, they have made decrees and said that the temporal power has no jurisdiction over them, but rather, on the other hand, that the spiritual is above the temporal power. Now, of course, you got to know they're talking about themselves when they refer to the spiritual. They're the leaders in the hierarchy of the Roman Catholic Church. They're the spiritual leaders, and they are higher than the temporal power. And the temporal power, the civil governments, have no jurisdiction. So they can sin and commit crimes and pedophilia and assassinations, and the civil government can't do a thing about it. That's what led to the protest. And that's still the effect today. Rome still claims the civil governments have no jurisdiction over the papacy. And that's why the crimes are unspeakable. The corruption is incalculable. And when the civil power kowtows to this, then what's the natural result? I want to ask my listeners, what is the natural result when the papacy stands up and says, you cannot jail one of my pedophile priests? They're mine to do with as I see fit. I am the head of the spiritual. You are the head of the temporal. You have no jurisdiction over my priest. What do you think that effect has? What effect does that have on the civil power? It makes them corrupt too. They follow the example of the spiritual, don't they? If they put themselves in a subservient role to the spiritual power and they see this open corruption, what hope in the world does anybody have that the civil power won't follow suit and become just as corrupt? Now you know why Washington, D.C. and all the governments of the world are as corrupt as Rome. Now what should the example really be? Christ is the head of the church. He was the spotless lamb. He sinned in nothing. And he commanded us all not to sin. And he bled for us so that our sins would be forgiven. Isn't that the role of the civil of the spirit, both the spiritual power and the temporal power? Isn't that the example that the civil power should follow? An example that is set by the spiritual? The head of the spiritual power is Christ. He's the example that both the church and the state are to follow. But what do we have today? Wall-to-wall corruption. Rome sets the example. The civil power follows that direction. And this is what the protesters, the Protestants, protested. Wall-to-wall corruption. First, when pressed by the temporal power, they, that is the spiritual power, have made decrees and said that the temporal power has no jurisdiction over them, but on the other hand, that the spiritual is above the temporal power. Second, when the attempt is made to reprove them out of the scriptures, They raised the objection that the interpretation of Scriptures belongs to no one except the Pope. Third, if threatened by a council, they answer that the fable that no one can call a council but the Pope. Okay, there's the three walls that the papists have built around themselves. They are the spiritual power, high and mighty, and above all, they have no authority over them. Secondly, that if you try to call a council, abandoning the civil power, the established civil governments, since they have no jurisdiction, they try to create a jurisdiction by calling a council that is a meeting of the civil and the religious leaders together to address the issue of this corruption. The Pope says no one has the power to call that council except the Pope. Okay? And thirdly, they won't accept any admonition at all from the Scriptures, from God's holy word, because only the papists have the right and the power and the wisdom to interpret the Scriptures. Interpretation of Scriptures belongs to no one but the Pope. Now you have the three walls that still encompass the Roman Catholic hierarchy. It's evident in the world today. You can't bring a pedophile priest to justice unless Rome allows it. And many times Rome doesn't. Case in point, the current Pope. A world-class criminal. Guilty of I don't know how many dead in Argentina and all of South America. Hustled off to the Vatican for protection against the legal jurisdictions that were pursuing him for crimes against humanity. And that's the case with many of the popes throughout history. So Martin Luther has a grievance. The same grievance that he hoped the nobility would recognize and then join him in the protest against Rome. All right, he continues. He says, in this wise, they have slyly stolen from us our rods. The rod of correction is what he's talking about. That they may go unpunished and have ensconced themselves within the safe stronghold of these three walls, that they may practice all the knavery and the wickedness which we now see. Even when they have been compelled to hold a council, they have weakened its power in advance by previously binding the princes with an oath to let them remain as they are. In other words, the Pope, when he is forced to convene a council to handle the corruption of his priesthood, of himself and his priesthood, he has ahead of time, ahead of the assembly of this council, contacted the nobility that were to form this council and make them agree to leave the papacy alone. And only on that agreement would he allow the council to hold session. Okay? Vote fixing. Rome is expert at it. It's where the whole concept of vote fixing comes from. You see corruption in the voting booths today, they're just following the example of the historical popes. Tainting the councils. We'll convene this council only on the agreement that no one will attempt to prosecute the papacy for these so-called crimes. Okay? They're kangaroo courts. They're kangaroo councils. Okay? Just like Pope Pius IX's council when he convened Vatican Council I, where he declared himself infallible. The people who protested against this decree of papal infallibility would just refuse to attend. And some were warned not to come. So the Jesuits stacked the council in favor of papal infallibility, and that's why they have it today. Rome is genius at this. All right, continuing, he says, moreover, they have given the Pope full authority over all the decisions of the council. So that is all one, whether there are many councils or no councils at all, except that they have deceived us with puppet shows and sham battles. Okay? Every council that's called is a puppet show. It's all fixed. It's all rigged. And even if some rogue shows up at these councils and demands authority over the Pope to correct this corruption, the Pope reserves to himself full authority over all decisions made by the councils. In other words, he can nullify them. Null and void. That's all he has to do. Null and void. As if the council never even convened. This is the power that the papacy arrogates to itself. Is this the example that the civil, or rather that the spiritual power is to exert in the world? This must be the power of Antichrist. This is not the power of Christ, who never violated one jot or one tittle of the law. He was the perfect example for both the spiritual and the temporal powers. So what can the papacy be but Antichrist, claiming no jurisdiction by the scriptures, or by the councils, or by the civil power, to arrogate to himself even the decision to overthrow the decisions of councils and princes, to say that he is the judge of every man and no man may judge him, despite unspeakable and uninterrupted corruption for nearly 1,500 years in this world. That cannot be a Christian society, a Christian organization. Martin Luther realized this. That's why he's writing this. He says, so terribly do they fear for their skin in a really free council. And they have intimidated kings and princes by making them believe it would be an offense against God not to obey the popes in all these knavish and crafty deceptions. Unquote. That's the power that the papacy always has over the princes of the world. He can threaten them with eternal damnation. He can intimidate kings and princes by simply casting them into purgatory, by simply moving their crowns, and they cease to be kings and princes. Power corrupts, and absolute power corrupts absolutely. Look, the kings and the princes of the world are all in this together with the popes. It's the Pope that gives them the power to rule. It's the Pope that puts on their heads their crowns of authority and gives them the power to rule over Christ's heritage, you and me. And if they revere and respect their own titles, their own authority, surely they're going to protect and cover up the power and authority of the Pope, aren't they? Because the Pope's the one that gave them their authority in the first place. To come out against the papacy is to put their own power and authority in jeopardy because they got their power and authority from the popes. You see how the papacy has stacked the deck of cards? All in favor of itself? He says, Martin Luther says, now God help us and give us one of the trumpets with which the walls of Jericho were overthrown, that we may blow down these walls of straw and paper, and may set free the Christian rods of the punishment for sin, bringing to light the craft and the deceit of the devil, to the end that through punishment we may reform ourselves and once more attain God's favor. Martin Luther saying, you want God's favor? Then we must overthrow these three walls that the papacy has built around itself. And we must bring them to justice. If we desire God's favor, this is what we must do. We must blow the trumpet until the walls of Jericho come tumbling down. Can you imagine how Rome received these words from Martin Luther? Likening Vatican City to Jericho? Likening the papacy to the devil? You think Rome really wants to celebrate the 500th year anniversary of the Protestant Reformation? Or do they want to crucify Martin Luther? Here's more of what Martin Luther said. Against the first walls we will direct our first attack. It is pure invention that Pope, bishops, priests, and monks are to be called the quote-unquote spiritual estate. Princes, lords, artisans, and farmers, the temporal state. Okay? What's Martin Luther just said? We are all brethren, and Christ is our head. We are all, if we dwell in flesh and blood, we are all equal in the sight of God, and God is no respecter of persons. There's no division between the spiritual and the temporal state. And boy, am I anxious to get into this, but we've come to the end of our broadcast. We'll continue with the reading and discussion of this marvelous Protestant work tomorrow on Inquisition Update. Thanks for listening.
Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org. When it comes to prophecy today, much of the evangelical Christian world has their eyes on Israel, waiting and watching to see when the third temple will begin to be built. The plans are drawn, the Jewish people are eager. Most evangelical Christians today believe that the rapture will happen before the third temple is built. Hi, I'm Michael Eugene. I was taught that Daniel's 70th week was in the future. Is that really what the Bible teaches? Have we searched the scriptures and found this to be true? Why is it so important for a re-established Israel to build a third temple in Jerusalem? Is it necessary to build a temple on the same location already occupied by the Dome of the Rock? Is it necessary for sacrifices to take place in the temple on Temple Mount? Is there really a rapture followed by 7 years of tribulation? What is the New Testament temple? Can we identify history and prophecy? Who is the first beast in Revelation chapter 13? Who are the 7 kings in Revelation 17? I have asked all these questions, and I have found Nicholas Arthur's new book, When the Third Temple is Built, answers all these questions and more using Scripture to interpret Scripture. The Bible says that no prophecy of Scripture is of any private interpretation. Nicholas shows us in his new book, When the Third Temple is Built, how the Bible interprets prophecy and not man's private interpretation. Visit crosstheborder.org, CROSS, crosstheborder.org, to get your print, EPUB, or PDF version of Nicholas Arthur's new book titled When the Third Temple is Built. That's crosstheborder.org.